Hi, hello, hi everyone. Um, Good night. My name is Mariana Pestana, and I'm sorry I was delayed. It's nice to not see you all, but to be here in this digital space with you. And thank you to the AF for the invitation. It's a really nice series, and I've watched some of these um, bedtime stories. So I thought today I would read a couple of excerpts from two books, and they're really about time. I thought that in this period during the quarantine and also since COVID-19, perhaps the most tangible change that I've noticed had to do with time. On the one hand, of course, during the quarantine and the isolation period, this sense that time had expanded, the day-to-day, um, um, the day-to-day feeling of the hours and the days kind of seemed a bit longer. And then also all of this institution of specific timelines to do with the contamination. So the need to stay home for the period of a week, all of these debate about how many hours does the virus remain in a certain surface, and that sort of dictating a new kind of order and routine. But anyway, and then I thought so the texts that have recently been quite important to me, and have been those that have to do with this idea of expanding time. And so I've picked. There were two texts that came to mind when Rosie and the team asked me to do this, and one of them was so the main one is this book by Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, which is Matters of Care, and specifically I'll be reading from a chapter called Soil Times. And then, but I thought as an introduction, it would be nice to read Doreen Massey and this text, Some Times of Space, which I find really interesting. So I'll read that to you, and then I'll read a little bit of Maria Puig. I apologize for my accent, and I'm sure this won't be like an extremely smooth reading, but maybe pay more attention to the content if you can. So I'll start. Expectations. The most predictable remark you can make about the weather concerns, of course, is unpredictability. James Gleick tells a story about the beginnings of understanding chaos in which meteorology is central. Clouds represented a side of nature that the mainstream of physics had passed by, a side that was at once fuzzy and detailed, structured and unpredictable. For as long as the world has had physicists inquiring to the laws of nature, it has suffered a special ignorance about disorder in the atmosphere. As the revolution in chaos runs its course, the best physicists find themselves returning without embarrassment to a phenomena on a human scale. They study not just galaxies, but clouds. And it is indeed odd that in a world where there is instantaneous communication, journeyings to other planets, genetic manipulation, in other words, the most incredible technological wizardry and control, you can still walk out of the house and quite unexpectedly get totally drenched from head to foot. There is a house I visit often in southern France. This region of northern Catalonia, lying between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, between the Pyrenees and the Cevennes, is at the mercy of the winds. Each wind has a name: Venteal, Gregal, Levant, Midjourn, Transmontana. The kind of weather the district receives depends on which of these is blowing through at any given hour. Each brings a distinctive temperature, rainfall or lack of it, humidity, even quality of light. The violent storms of the Tramontana, the fierce cold in the mountains to the south, the clear dryness of the Mediterranean, each of these also varies by season. A small shift in the configuration of the ever-mobile weather system, and you have to rethink your plans for the day. Yet this account of the expectation of variability is founded on its own temperate zone assumptions. There are places where you can rely for days or even weeks on end on sunshine, or on freezing cold, or on the fact that it will rain. Even the expectation of variability then might leave you surprised. And even in these weather-obsessed islands, the unpredictability of conditions is regularly denied in the service of caricature. Lazy journalists evoke dreariness through reference to wet mornings in Walsall or Telford. Why these places? They are clearly not always raining. The weather is enlisted to heighten an effect, to typify. The assumption is that we are not from such places, or that there are no wet mornings where we are. Rather, we are recruited along with the weather into collaboration with the sneering superiority of the writer. This is perhaps a vestigial survival of the wider and persistent phenomenon of moral climatology. However, we smile together at the image of dullness, for the caricature of the weather is used not just to indicate what undoubtedly is the case, that the weather is different from place to place, a positive variability, but to establish a mutual characterization. All visitors to the house in Catalonia are warned, do not leave the house without securing the shutters. It could be that unexpectedly the tramontana will blow. Encounters. Imagine a journey. It does not have to be an epic one. It could be quite quotidian. Simply from here to there. From Manchester to Liverpool, let's say. One way to picture it is as travelling across space. You're moving between two places on a map. Manchester and Liverpool are given, and you, the active one, travel between them. You have a trajectory. Now, think of it another way. For this movement of yours is not just spatial, it's also temporal. So you're barely out of Manchester, approaching the mosses that stretch away flat on either side, when Manchester itself has moved on. Lives have pushed ahead, business has been done, the weather has changed. That collection of trajectories, that is Manchester, is no longer the same as when you left it. It has lived on without you. And Liverpool? Likewise, it has not just been lying there static on the map awaiting your arrival. It too has been going on about its business, moving on. Your arrival in Lime Street, when you step off the train, begin to get into the things you came here to do. It's a meeting up of trajectories as you entangle yourself in stories that began before you arrived. This is not the arrival of an active voyager in an awaiting passive destination, but an intertwining of ongoing trajectories from which something new may emerge. Movement, encounter, and the making of relationships take time. It's impossible to encounter something with no preconceptions at all, but the full recognition that they encountered is also moving on, at least slightly, disturbs one's confidence in the fact that these expectations will be met. An encounter is always with something on the move. The voyager is not the only active one. Origin and destination have lives of their own. And I'll stop here and I'll move on to Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, which is also about time, but specifically about soil time. And this is a chapter of the book, and it's the last chapter. It's called Soil Times, the Pace of Ecological Care. Human soil relations are a captivating terrain to engage with the intricate entanglements of material necessities, affective intensities, and ethico-political troubles of caring obligations in the more than human worlds marked by technoscience. Increasingly, since the first agricultural revolutions, the predominant drive underlying human soil relations has been to pace their fertility with demands for food production and other needs such as fiber or construction grounds. But at the turn of the 21st century, Earth's soils regained consideration in public perception and culture due to global anti-ecological disturbances. Soils are now up on the list of environmental matters calling for global care. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations declared 2015 the International Year of Soils, expressing concerns for this finite, non-renewable resource on a human timescale and the pressure of processes such as degradation, poor management, and loss to urbanization. Soils have become a regular media topic, drawing attention to the hidden world beneath our feet, a new frontier for knowledge and fascination about the life teeming in this dark alterity. Human persistent mistreatment and neglect of soils is emphasized in calls that connect the economic, political, and ethical value of soils to matters of human survival. Recent headlines by environmental analysts in the UK press reiterate this. We are treating soil like dirt. It's a fatal mistake, as our lives depend on it. Or, peak soil, industrial civilization is on the verge of eating itself. Warnings proliferate against a relatively immediate gloomy future that could see the global exhaustion of fertile land with correlated food crisis. So while soils remain a resource of value extraction for human consumption and a recalcitrant frontier of inquiry for science, they are also increasingly considered endangered living worlds in need of urgent ecological care. I end this speculative exploration of meanings of care in more than human worlds, because this is the last chapter of the book, by beginning another research journey grounded in the specific landscape of ecological care for the soil. In this book, I have worked from and for a vision that embeds care relations in mundane doings of maintenance and repair that sustain everyday life rather than on moral dispositions. It is partly because of the devalued significance of care that feminist research on practices of care is often oriented by an ethico-political commitment to investigate the significance of neglected things, practices, and experiences made invisible or marginalized by dominant, successful, techno-scientific mobilizations. This way, paying attention to practices of care can be a way of getting involved with glimpses of alternative livable relationalities, with other possible worlds in the making, alter ontologies, the heart of dominant configurations. In this spirit, the critical inquiry into human-soil relations of care presented in this chapter is not so much driven to debunk the productionist subjection of soils, but by an aspiration to engage speculatively with imperceptible tendencies that could be troubling, and reworking these dominant relations from within by transforming everyday soil care. So, like all the other chapters, this one is written from the partiality of the speculative commitments, thinking with care, as a way to elicit conceptions and practices that have the potential to disrupt the reduction of soil to a resource for humans. Attention to ways in which notions of soil care could potentially be transformed in these times of environmental unsettledness brings to light possible alternative practical, ethical, and effective ecologies. I therefore engage with soils as matters of care. Human-soil relations of care and soil ontologies are entangled. What soil is thought to be affects the ways in which it is cared for, and vice versa. Modes of care have effects in what soils become. In this chapter, the speculative thought on more than human care follows my research immersion into contemporary changes in human-soil relations to which I was drawn through my interest in permaculture. But by engaging care to think a context of fearful futures around the destruction of Earth's soils, and by looking into current challenges to the long-standing conformation of productionist relations, an additional theme I was not expecting also came forth: the uneasiness posed by care within anthropocentric temporalities of technoscientific futurity. Care, of course, has been traditionally associated with reproducing rather than productivity, and so thinking speculative with care time, where productionist timelines prevail, still opens up interesting questions. This book therefore ends by inviting attention to a temporal dimension of care that the previous chapters only implicitly hinted at. Care as the fostering of the endurance of objects through time. So maintenance against breakdown. Haptic care for the imperceptible politics of the everyday, rather than the eruption of events. By exploring this elusive but important feature of the doings of care, that is, the recalcitrance of the temporality of care to productionist rhythms, I reflect on how care time entails making time to get involved with a diversity of timelines, such as the ones involved in the living soil, that make the web of more than human agencies. Human-soil relations have a complex and fascinating history with very different local actualizations. My focus here is on their contemporary history in traditions driven by industrial agricultural revolutions, rather than exploring alternative relations with soil in other cultures or geographies. This is partially because this is where I'm situated and where my research is still at the time of writing, but also because I am looking for indications that the traditional harnessing and subordination of multiple temporal rhythms of soil care to the linear temporalities of technoscientific productionism could be contested within the very inheritances of agricultural revolutions. So, I'm not looking to create a space for care outside present predicaments and hegemonies, but within. My point of departure is soil science, a scientific field that has been closely intertwined with societal and economic concerns across the decades, a relation deeply affecting its research agendas. While the importance of soils for agricultural needs has bound knowledge about the soil to human economies of survival since ancient times, it is only since the mid-19th century that scientific developments in chemistry, physics, and biology coalesce into the interdisciplinary field of the soil sciences. It is in close entanglement with this modern history that the soil became a distinguishable object of scientific, experimental, and field studies, applied and non-applied. This is a fascinating field that is changing fast, and part of these changes are disturbing the traditional relation with productionism and exposing soil as a living world rather than a mere receptacle and input for crop nutrition. Yet, in order to indicate how something might be changing, I first delve into the historical context that gives significance to discussing current scientific conceptions of soil's ecological interdependencies in terms of their temporal implications. This is to focus on one of those conceptions, the food web model of soil ecology, which conceives soil as a living multi-species world. In order to think speculatively on this vision's potential to alter conceptions of soil care beyond science, I explore how it has become a figuration of embodied care in human-soil relationalities across different spheres of soil practice. The significance of the food web conception goes beyond its explanatory power or epistemic value for science to engage humans in ethical obligations of care. From a temporal perspective, these obligations require an intensification of involvement in making time for soil-specific temporalities. Focusing on the temporal experiences of ecological care helps to reveal a diversity of interdependent temporalities of beings and things, human and not, at the heart of the predominant futuristic timescales of technoscientific expectations. It is technoscientific futurity that care time might intercept, because getting involved with soil's temporalities in a more caring way implies a disruption of current modes of temporal dominance in more than human worlds, including their ratification by prevalent conceptions of innovation. And so I will now read to you a sub-chapter, and if we have time I'll continue on to the conclusion of this chapter. So it's called Technoscientific Futurity. Human agricultural practices have exhausted soils across the world well before industrialization, pushing human populations to leave depleted soils behind in search of fertile grounds. In the current global productionist regime, options are recognized to be narrowing. as the extension of agricultural land by forest clearing is a documented factor of climate change, and the intensification of production in available land is destroying the resource. Humanity's vital need for soil serves the argument that the acceleration of its loss might be more worrying than the well-reported peak soil, and the correlatives peak nitrate and peak phosphorus refer to forewarnings of economic collapse by which a resource is bound to exhaustion without equivalent efforts to renew it, as it becomes more difficult to extract and more expensive. Countless accounts refer to strains on soil caused by human population growth, warning of famine waves, typically reciting figures approaching 10 billion by 2050, announcing famine outbreaks if action is not urgently taken to ensure food security. And yet, soil exhaustion is also blamed across the board on industrialized and unsustainable forms of agriculture, and so many see intensifying food production through techno-scientific innovations as a misled, perilous response to food security. Similar to other environmental warnings, such as urging people to wake up, freak out, then get a grip in response to climate change tipping points, the temporal emergency in soil breakdown warnings is clear. The time to care more and better for soils is now. It is likely that the impending loss of soil will affect how the inheritors of agricultural revolutions care about this vital universe. And what this could mean is also marked by tensions in this temporal atmosphere. The future of soils appears to be pulled forward by an accelerated timeline toward a gloomy environmental future, while the time left for action in the present is compressed by urgency. And so, the temporal pace required by soil's ecological care as a slow, renewable resource might again be at odds with these conditions of emergency, running against the accelerated linear rhythm of intervention, characteristic of techno-scientific futuristic response, traditionally straddled to a productionist pace. Sensing techno-scientific futurity as a specific timescape, a notion borrowed by Barbara Adams' Sociology of Time, stresses the temporal features of living. Thinking with timescapes, contextual temporal practices become tangible. Timescapes are thus the embodiment of practiced approaches to time. Timescapes are devices to think epochal time in terms of their everyday actualizations, resistances, and contradictions. In other words, epochal, practical, and embodied timescales are entangled. They do and undo each other. Thinking techno-scientific futurity as a timescape allows space for thinking practices as time-making and envisioning what doings and agencies could be disrupting the overpowering atmosphere of ecological anxiety so consistent with the hegemony of future-oriented timelines in techno-scientific societies. The features of this particular timescape of futurity have been illuminated in science and technology studies and sociology from several critical perspectives. First, techno-scientific futurity has been discussed with regards to the persistence of a modern paradigm that associates the future with progress, with an ethico-political imperative to advance that remains solidly the orientation of linear, progressivist timelines, while the past acts as a discriminatory signifier of development delay. From the perspective of this hegemonic timescape, as faith in modern linear progress is increasingly put into question by an environmental crisis, uncertainty prevails, and catastrophic regression seems inescapable. Second, the future orients practices. It acts as the inexhaustible pool of techno-scientific expectation, that is, the socio-affective engine of innovation-driven political economies, as well as the promissory science. And here, techno-scientific innovation is situated and affected by a shared timescape of futurity typical of late capitalist economies, a timescape that fuels preemptive strategies and subjects practices in the present to a productionist ethos increasingly committed to the speculative extraction of future economic value. Third is the anticipatory effective state of technoscientific futurity that Funken Adams, Michelle Murphy, and Adele Clark have insightfully characterized as one of permanent anxiety, in which our presence are necessarily understood as contingent upon an ever changing astral future that may or may not be known for certain, still must be acted on nonetheless. I'll read this again. So, a kind of a state of permanent anxiety in which our presence are necessarily understood as contingent upon an ever-changing astral future that may or not may be known for certain, still must be acted on nonetheless. Technoscience's innovation-driven focus on novelty fosters uncertainty and expectation about an imminent breakthrough that could change it all for the better or the worse. Any meaningful act in the world of promissory capitalism involves taking risks and acting fast. In this form of futurity, the everyday experience of time is one of permanent precariousness. An ongoing sense of urgency and crisis calls us to act now, while the present of action is diminished, mortgaged to an always unsure tomorrow. Industriously advancing and producing might give the beat to get practice going, but the continuity of existence is also constantly challenged, injecting drama and fear into everyday doings. The hype, characteristic of futuristic progress-driven innovation, is codependent with fear of doom and hopes for salvation. The restless work involved in managing anticipation and calculation in the face of uncertain futures is the late capitalism pendant of modernity's impossible efforts to manage and control time. And if I had the time, I would read to you the full chapter, but since we don't have more time, I'll just finish with a little conclusion, and hopefully this will make you read the full chapter and book. Indeed, if we think of time from the perspective of earthworm communities, artificial fertilization of soils aimed at accelerating yield would be a slowing down of the development of worms and other essential soil communities. Meanwhile, interventions that adjust to the pace of soil communities' reproductive capacities foster the proliferation and thriving of their habitats. What seems slow or backward when living according to human timeline or timescale might have a different sense in another. And so, this speculative journey into care agencies in modern human relations ends up joining calls for decentering and unlinear anthropocentric temporalities in order to make time for a multiplicity of others. This comes close to the temporal requirements for conceiving nature in the active voice. Michel Bastien's shows how the possibilities of attributing significant agency to non-humans is hindered by a dominant linear conception of time, for which change and innovation are only deemed possible for human individual self-directed actions that break from the past but remain within a logic of production that requires human control. With Plumwood, Bastien critiques this idea and argues for exposing the unexpected changes, the events that other human creative agencies bring to happen. Interestingly, this journey into care time meets diverse temporalities from a different path, not so much that of valuing other than human events and creative ruptures, and therefore also disrupting the dominant anthropocentric view of innovation, but by emphasizing uneventful, everyday, daily occurrences as transformative. But while the paths might be dissimilar, they concur in affirming what the current dualisms of technoscientific futurity tend to render invisible: the co-making of temporal scales, of the ordinary and the eventful, the so-called reproductive and the productive. It is precisely the repetition necessary to reproduction that opens all living organisms to the ever-present possibility that they might reproduce in ways both unintended and both unintended and unexpected. The very possibility that the extraordinary may arise from the ordinary. To argue for a disruption of futuristic time through making care time is therefore not so much about a slowing down of time, nor a redirection of timelines, but an invitation to rearrange and rebalance relations between a diversity of coexisting temporalities that inhabit the worlds of soil and other interdependent ecologies. And so I think I will have to end here, as it's half an hour. Thank you so much for listening if you were there. And now I will save this conversation. Have a good night, and I hope that this text will inspire you to think differently about time and soil time.